You're listening to the 40 Fit Radio podcast, dedicated to the 40-plus community. Join us as we discuss the truth about fitness and health using science, reason, and the experiences of our host and content experts. Welcome to the 40 Fit Nation. Hey guys, welcome back to the 40 Fit Radio and welcome to the 40 Fit Nation. I'm your host, Coach D, and today we're going to talk about central nervous system fatigue. I'm by myself on this episode. Coach Trent is out, but we're going to talk a little bit about the science and some of the facts and fictions surrounding what is known as, in the strength and a lot of the powerlifting circles, as central nervous system fatigue. So that's what we're going to cover today. So if we lose you in a little bit of the sciencey stuff, we'll come back around at the end of the podcast and hit some high points so that you have a better understanding of where we're at. But I got a question the other day on Instagram, and the question was, hey, what do you think about central nervous system fatigue and how it relates to strength or resistance training and getting stronger? And that's a really loaded question with a loaded answer. I mean, central nervous system fatigue we can't cover in just one short podcast. But what my goal is today is to basically bring to you the basics as I know it of the science that's out there on central nervous system fatigue, what the central nervous system is, how it differs from the peripheral nervous system, and then other peripheral factors, and how that might relate to your training. So let me just say on the front end that if you are a novice or you are earlier in your training and probably all the way up into an intermediate and even into an early advanced lifter, central nervous system fatigue probably plays less a significant role than others would have you to believe out in the industry and the people that talk about this. You are basically still getting stronger through the strength recovery adaptation cycle. You're still a novice, or you're in your intermediate phase of training, or you're even your more advanced phase of training, but you're still using programming that is in a linear progression fashion, just with some alterations, a little bit more advanced. Then it's not that central nervous system fatigue, like lots of other fatigue factors or types of fatigue, aren't a factor in your training, but it's not in isolation itself. It's like a lot of things, you can't just think of central nervous system fatigue and say, that's the reason why I'm not adapting. There are tons of factors there that you've got to consider, and we'll talk a little bit about those things. But what we like to do as lifters, or what people like to do, is they like to find something that they can hang their hat on and say, well, this is the reason why I'm not adapting, or this is the reason why I'm not getting stronger, or this is the reason why I need to change my programming. And as you hear usually from me, it is stick to the basics, stay with the basics, and for 95 to 99%, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but let's just say roughly a very, very high percentage, more than not, central nervous system fatigue is not something that you need to be concerned with and that you need to isolate as a factor of why you're not adapting. Now, if you're a more advanced lifter, you're way up at the top of that maximum genetic potential. You're a competitor, or you're in a particular performance sport where you're at the edge of your competition level, where you're right there in the elite competitors, then central nervous system fatigue might be something that you need to accommodate for in your programming. But again, that doesn't mean that you should change your entire programming as in isolation due to this concept. So let's talk a little bit about first, what is the central nervous system? The central nervous system is basically your brain stem, your spinal cord, and those elements. So that is the central nervous system. So what is the peripheral nervous system? The peripheral nervous system are all of the peripheral nerves that branch off of the spinal cord. We also have what we would call the peripheral system, or just the periphery, and those are all the target organs that the peripheral nervous system and central nervous system feeds information to create particular actions. So that might be muscle cells, that might be heart cells, lung cells, liver, kidney cells, bone cells, whatever the skin cells, whatever the target organs are. So those are the two different really the three different systems that we have here. And what we're going to talk today about mostly is the central nervous system and what these systems feed, okay? Now, first of all, it's important for our audience to understand that if you think about the central nervous system, you can think about it like a computer tower, and the computer tower is telling the peripheral nervous system, which would be the monitor, the mouse, and the keyboard. We're bringing input in from the monitor and the mouse and the keyboard. Well, actually, the monitor produces output, okay, and the keyboard and the mouse produces input. So that's kind of how the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system work together. And in a nutshell, this is a very simple layman's term. The central nervous system tells you to squat 315 and gives you the instructions to do so and sends the signal to do so. And then the peripheral nervous system and the periphery basically carry that action out. And that's a really good way to think about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and all the surrounding target organs. So what is central nervous system fatigue? Central nervous system fatigue is basically the brain and the spinal cord failing to produce an appropriate or a proper stimulus due to being in a state of fatigue. And there are many different theories as to how central nervous system fatigue occurs and how big a factor it is during sports or performance training as it relates to strength training, aerobic conditioning, all of the 10 general physical skills, okay? But some of the theories and some of the outside, I guess you would say some of the factors that are outside of exercise itself, because exercise can be one way that the central nervous system becomes fatigued. But also, it could be due to elevated serotonin, dopamine, and acetylcholine levels, which are all of basically the neurotransmitters that your brain, your central nervous system, and your peripheral nervous system uses to transmit impulses back and forth from your body to the nervous system. It could also be due to a compromised immune system. And you and I know that our immune system gets compromised from many different things. It could be that training compromised your immune system, that exercise itself, that's a form of stress to your immune system. It could be that you were sick recently, or that you didn't get adequate rest, or that you've not been sleeping well, or that you got poor nutrition, that you haven't had a good enough diet and you haven't had the adequate amount of nutrition. And that's in that third area, which would be inadequate sleep and nutrition. But these are some of the things I would also say that I would also add into that. Another thing that could cause it is emotional stress or mental stress, that you've got a lot on your plate mentally and you've got a lot of things going on, and it's hard for you to focus, or you're just mentally tapped out. You know, the brain's an organ, and the brain runs almost entirely on sugar, on glycogen, but the brain is an organ, and the brain can get fatigued. You know how it is, when you're in college and you've been thinking all day long, or you've been in tough meetings for hours and hours and hours, and you've been crunching numbers, or you've been under a lot of stress, mentally and emotionally, and then you're asked to go do something else that's difficult. It's very hard to focus, and your brain basically your brain just kind of short circuits, and that also could lead to central nervous system fatigue. But when we talk about CNS fatigue as it relates to training or recovery, then we're talking about a different function, okay? And there's a misconception of what can cause CNS fatigue. So it's really tough to say what the origins of the theories of central nervous system fatigue and research and in powerlifting or in strength training are. But generally speaking, we think about it with older Russian weightlifting coaches and that they thought it could play a role in strength training and in the way that they would program their athletes and their lifters. And then that came over to the States with guys like Louis Simmons and also all the Russian coaches that were over in Russia. And then also from books like Super Training by Mel Siff. But all these people these authorities begin to talk about central nervous system fatigue as a factor when programming or training for strength training. And so that's kind of where it all got its general start. And over the years, there's been, like we talked about, there's been very limited research. There's been very limited research on exactly what causes it and how big of a factor it is in training for strength. there have been several studies that have been done, and as recent as 2017, and some of this work is new work. And what's interesting is that for years we've kind of all been told, or kind of thought, because of the general consensus among the strength community, that central nervous system fatigue was due to high stress, high load, or high intensity strength training, and linked to, more complicated movements, everything from Olympic lifting to the heavy barbell lifts. But some of the new research actually contradicts that and states that the new evidence does have that central nervous system fatigue does have an effect, but that the research suggests that it occurs to a greater extent with lower intensity, long duration exercise than with higher intensity exercise. Now, the important thing to recognize here is that when we're talking about fatigue in general, we have to quantify and qualify what is fatigue. And unfortunately, there's no general consensus here. There's no way the best way to measure central nervous system fatigue is nerve conductance studies, EMGs, and maximum voluntary contraction. The problem is that when you measure maximum voluntary contraction of a muscle, how hard can a muscle contract and how much force can it produce? You have more than one system involved. You not only have the central nervous system involved, you have the peripheral nervous system involved, and then you have the target organ. So where is the fatigue really coming from? The only way that we know as of to date that the central nervous system might be the culprit in the fatigue is that there is a reduction in electromyographic conductance, or speed, down the shaft of the nerve in regards to the stimulus that's being produced by the brain, by the central tower, computer tower, then going out to the target organ. The problem with that too is there could be a peripheral nerve impairment. There could be a problem with the peripheral nervous system. And so it's really hard to measure that, but we do know that most recently research has been done on strength training specifically, and in one particular study that two PhDs looked at, they found they measured it during deadlifts, and they measured it during squats, and they measured it also during the bicep contraction, and they looked at lower intensity exercise for longer durations, and they looked at higher intensity exercises at much higher maximum voluntary contraction rates, at like 95% of the 1 rep max. Then what they found was that the central nervous system fatigue seemed to be more of a factor in the longer duration, lower intensity exercise type. So that's kind of interesting when you look at that, when you throw that out there to the community, because for years we've thought that high intensity exercise, when it comes to load or power strength performance, that was more of a factor than lower intensity exercise with higher volume. And that may not be the case necessarily. And so what I think you could say about this is this. Again, we should not look at this particular concept in isolation. There are lots of reasons why people don't meet their strength targets or get stronger at the rate than they thought they should. And I think there are other factors that are more important at the end of the day than just central nervous system fatigue. Another interesting thing is that they found that the muscle cell is slower to recover as the target organ than the central nervous system is in its ability to produce the stimulus down to the muscle cell. So in other words, the central nervous system may be recovering faster than the muscular elements would, or than the muscular system is. So again, the muscular components, the ability, the cell membrane potential, the ability of the muscle to recover and to build the cell wall, to get stronger, to adapt through the stress recovery adaptation cycle, that all those things might be a larger factor than central nervous system fatigue in itself. You know what I think is kind of interesting is sometimes we as individuals that are involved in training programs, exercise programs, we want to point to one new thing that's been found, or we want to point to one factor that's been found to hang our hat on. And in reality, what we might be doing is shortchanging the basic foundations of a really good strength training program or a really good training program model. And what I would really suggest that we all do to start with is to look at our training program and number one, make sure that we're doing the program. Make sure that we are training consistently, and if it's strength training, that we're in the proper training program for our phase or state of development in relationship to where we are as a lifter, an athlete within our sport, and the type of training that's been being applied to us in regards to our maturity. Number two, we need to make sure that our rest and our nutrition is spot on. Those are huge factors to sports performance and to strength gains. Those are factors that have a much greater determinant of whether or not you're going to hit your strength gains or whether or not you're going to get your speed gains or whatever the skill that you're trying to develop is than your central nervous system fatigue. And then number three, we need to make sure that our program is a solid program based on science, that it's not only appropriate for us in our stage of development, that number two, that it's based on solid science and that it makes sense, because that's important. Because there's a lot of programs out there that are hully-gully, that really don't have a scientific basis, and the basic training principles just don't make sense. So in wrapping this up, and what are some of the basic takeaways of this concept with central nervous system fatigue? Number one, training doesn't occur in isolation. That there are lots of factors. Training, as we say all the time in the podcast, it's multivariate. There are a ton of variables here. And I think that you as a lifter or an athlete should first look at the fact that training doesn't occur in isolation, and you should go back to the basics. You should start with the idea that, number one, do I have the right training program for my stage of development? Number two, do I have a training program that's based on solid science? Number three, am I getting adequate rest and recovery as needed based on where I am as an athlete, a lifter, or whatever you're doing? Am I getting adequate recovery that matches where I am in my cycle of development? Number four, am I supporting my training program with proper nutrition? And am I getting the right dietary supplements and elements, vitamins, minerals? And am I eating enough protein? We always talk about protein on this podcast. Am I getting enough nutrition to support the gains that I want? Number five, am I getting enough sleep and gentle rest? We're not talking about recovery alone, just the absence of training on those off days, but am I actually getting enough rest? And am I getting enough sleep? Is it deep sleep? Is it quality sleep? And so when we think about our training program, instead of, just attach ourselves to central nervous system fatigue or some other singular factor, I think all these other factors are larger factors and probably play a bigger role. The other thing, that we could talk about more specifically, and then we've talked about in other episodes, is when you're designing that training program, you can begin to variate exercises as your development becomes more advanced. Your program does have to become a little bit more complicated over time. The intensity levels need to change. The types of exercises will change some. You might have some days where you do heavy lifts. You might have some days where you do back off days, or you do, medium lifting intensity days. You might add in some accessory exercises on days after you've done heavier lifts to give your quote unquote central nervous system, and really I would just say your immune system as a whole, a rest. Because what we really believe now at this point is that your central nervous system is probably adapting a lot faster than we know. And it really just could be your peripheral system, the extra muscular elements, the connective tissue elements, your biochemical elements, your metabolic system that is still trying to recover and organically build a better cell, a better machine to perform for you in whatever your chosen sport or recreation is. So, hey guys, that's all I have on central nervous system fatigue for today. We could go really, really deep into this subject, but I think it's way overblown. And I think for most of the audience out there listening to this, we need to focus on just good, solid training principles and push this subject to the side a little bit. Not that we're not aware that it exists, But if you're not meeting your gains, it's highly unlikely that it's due to just this one factor. It's probably more foundational and basic in its nature. And I would recommend that you focus on those things first and make sure that you've got everything spot on before you look to this as a factor. If this is a factor, then there are some things that you could do programming-wise, and we might cover that in another episode. So thanks for joining us here today on the 40 Fit Radio podcast. You can check us out on Instagram, and that's at 40 Fit Radio. You can check me out on Instagram at drdeaton, and you can also go to 40fit.com and go to the 40 Fit Radio podcast tab and download our podcast there. You can also send us an email at info@40fit.com. And we love having you here on the podcast too. We love having you listen. We love having you listen to the podcast. Share this with your friends. Give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen, Spotify, wherever you listen to us on. And hope you have a great day. And thanks for joining the 40 Fit Nation.